This is thinkenergy, the podcast that helps you better understand the fast-changing world of energy through conversations with game changers, industry leaders, and influencers. So join me, Dan Sege, as I explore both traditional and unconventional facets of the energy industry.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Did you scroll through the news this morning? How many of those articles that you skimmed covered a topic related to climate change? I guess it was probably a few. It seems every couple of weeks there's a new story dominating the headlines about forest fires, hurricanes, floods, heat waves, and more, both here in Canada and abroad. We are seeing firsthand the effects of climate change, and as consumers, we are receiving information about it everywhere we look. Have you ever thought about how you are being communicated to? How is climate change presented? What wording was used and why? And are there calls to action? How does it make you feel? Think not only about news articles you read, but also about documentaries, podcasts, Hollywood movies, right down to your everyday life. Think about the newsletter you receive from your municipality, the assembly instruction on the last piece of furniture you purchased, or the section on your favorite clothing brand website about their sustainable practice. Communications surrounding climate change are pretty much everywhere, and they need to be. In June of 2021, the Canadian government introduced the Canadian Net Zero Emission Accountability Act, which puts into legislation Canada's commitment to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Different companies across the country are making their commitment, much like we did in 2022 when we committed to leading the way to a smart energy future by becoming net zero by 2030. The push is on to stop the damaging pollution emitted into the environment on a daily basis, namely caused by burning fossil fuels. Scientists are urging that this is crunch time. So, if you haven't already, now is the time to hone in on how and what you are communicating to your customers. So, here is today's big question. What role do communicators play in motivating change within their audiences to take action against climate change? Our guest today is Amber Bennett, Deputy Director of ReClimate, Canada's first climate communications and engagement center. This new organization, launched in 2022, brings together Canada's leading climate communication academics and practitioners and aims to help communicators create strategies that inspire the public to support climate action. Amber is one of Canada's top climate communication strategists and capacity builder who works with groups across the country bridging gaps between research and practice. She led the groundbreaking Alberta Narrative Project and supported much of the foundational work to pilot and build ReClimate. Amber, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Amber, maybe you can start by telling us a bit about yourself and ReClimate. How did you get into climate communications? How did ReClimate come to be? And what does it aim to achieve?
Okay, I'll try to hold all of those questions at once. Well, I am based in Calgary, Alberta, which may seem like an unlikely place for some, for the executive director of a Canadian organization or Canadian center focused on climate communications and engagement at Carleton University. But that's where I live with my family. And what to say? Yeah, I mean, I think I've been circling around climate communications for a very, very long time. You know, the mind has a funny way of making sense of things in retrospect, but I started with a Bachelor of Science, and then I moved on to a public relations degree. And then I worked with the mayor of Calgary on one of the I forget which numbered COP, but it was at Copenhagen. And I think that was really the first time I began to think about what is climate change, and had a certain kind of exposure to the what the challenge was and whatnot. And when I kind of went on and I did a master's degree, and it was when I needed to choose a topic for my master's degree was when there was the catastrophic flooding here in Calgary. And there was this like amazing paradox where the, Calgary Stampede, which is the epitome, I would say, of the, kind of old boys club. And when that happened, when the floods happened, their motto was come hell or high water. Come hell or high water, they were going to, produce the show. And at the same time, one of the readings I was doing as a part of my master's program was also titled Come Hell or High Water. And it was really about the science of climate change and what is making it so difficult. Why is it so difficult for humans to kind of wrap our heads around it? So fast forward, completed a master's and then did a series of really interesting projects, did some work with a group out of the UK called Climate Outreach, which is focused on climate communications and engagement as well. And then started working with a group of people here in Canada to set up a similar center or a similar organization that would focus on supporting climate communicators, helping to kind of bring together the research that is happening, as well as the practice. And so that's really what ReClimate is set up to do. We're really dedicated towards advancing the practice of climate communications and engagement through research, training, offering resources, pulling resources together, strategy, and developing strategy with other types of practitioners, as well as convening networks of both scholars as well as those people who are kind of out there in the real world doing campaigning and advocacy work and trying to, communicate with citizens and whatnot. So that's kind of where we're at.
Now, Amber, it sounds like ReClimate is a very diversified organization that brings together experts in social science, public affairs, and science. What kind of professionals work together in this environment, and what does it each bring to the table?
Love this question. So ReClimate brings together, I think I've said it, research and practice. And so you have those practitioners who may be doing public engagement campaigns. They may be working for utilities. They may be working in local governments or other kinds of government. They might also be working in advocacy organizations. And so they often don't have the time, or I would argue the luxury of going into, latest academic journals or even, kind of other thought leaders who are publishing on the field. Why? Because they're busy, they're doing the work. And so, that it kind of takes a lot of time to kind of go in, look at the research, track it down, make sense of it. There are also, I would argue, very few who have the time to do an evaluation. Like after they've done something, what did we learn from it? What did we make a difference? What kind of impact are we having? And similarly, just getting together with other folks, right? And talking about it and sharing what they're learning. So that's kind of on the practitioner side. And so, when we say we bring or convene networks of people together, we're really trying to do that. We're trying to provide resources, synthesize, research, both perhaps, it's public polling or maybe it's social science, what's happening in that's relevant, but also bringing people together to share with each other, learn with each other. So that's kind of that practitioner side. And, there's also, I would say, sometimes a culture where people feel like they're competing with each other, but certainly within the charitable sector. So kind of, I think for those folks who are coming in, who are kind of in the field, having that support and someone who's doing the work on their behalf to kind of make sense of, synthesize, pull it in together. Like, here's your 5 tips. Here are the things you need to do. That's extremely helpful. And then on the flip side, I think for researchers, they're kind of passionate. There's a reason why they're thinking or trying to understand, how to better engage people, or what's the right framing, or what are the values, or whatever. This is because they're passionate about it. So by being able to kind of bridge from the practitioner world into a more academic or into a research field, we're able to just give people real world challenges. It's like, here's what practitioners are actually struggling with. You're an expert in this. Please talk to us about it. Or please, this is the kind of information that they need. So, kind of the practitioners, I would say, bring the complexity of the real world, right? That we're dealing with real people, resource constraints, various kinds of issues and whatnot. Whereas researchers bring the kind of precision of being able to look at something with a whole body of understanding behind them, to be able to kind of see, well, here's what may be operating within this situation. Here's what we know about it. And here are some other kinds of interventions or approaches that we might be able to take. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question. Maybe the scientist part, I would say they bring the public trust, right? So whenever we're polling, consistently, scientists come up on top as having high levels of public trust on climate and energy transition. And so I think that they bring that kind of authenticity, and they're often unpolitical, right? They're not seen to be benefiting, personally from talking about it. So they're really effective messengers.
Wondering if you can share some insight into what the average Canadian knowledge on climate change is. How much do they know about the main causes and the path forward?
Well, I would say that Canadians probably know a lot about climate change, but what we measure, it's a little bit different. So and I would encourage folks to take a look at some of the reports that we have published on ReClimate.ca. The one that I kind of go back to was published this year, or maybe it was last year, but within these reports, we basically look across 65 or more, either private or publicly available surveys or public polls or whatnot. And we kind of do a roll up of, okay, so it's not just one survey that has said this, it's multiple surveys that are showing kind of trends and themes in where the Canadian beliefs or attitudes or mindsets are. So when you do that, and when we looked across, 65 or so, what you can see is that even though you have the majority of Canadians that would say, yes, climate change is real and it is happening, almost half of them attribute both natural and man-made causes, attribute the cause of climate change to natural causes as well as man-made. And so why is that important is because when we get into the conversations around solutions, then without the kind of foundational understanding that burning fossil fuels creates pollution, which creates a heat trapping blanket, which is heating our planet and causing all of these extreme weather events and natural disasters that we're seeing. Without that kind of clear understanding that burning fossil fuels is the cause of climate change, then when you get into the solutions and what people actually have to do about it, the conversation's a bit more, there's a lot of confusion, or there's a lot of room for confusion, which is kind of what we're seeing. And I can talk a little bit more about that. So, I spend a lot of time in focus groups, and this kind of conversation comes up. So when we talk about solutions and the path forward, you talk about climate change and you start to have discussion around what are you doing, recycling will often come up. Plastics will often come up. So there's a whole kind of suite of things that people are doing, but very few people are able to name like a particular policy or real intervention that that would address some of the root causes. And people on this podcast may not be like, hey, what, really? But there are a lot of different people, and for many, climate change, even though they may be living within the impacts or the experiencing in their daily lives, they have many other kinds of concerns and priorities that are happening at the same time. So what I would say is that Canadians believe that climate change is happening. There is at least half that are uncertain or would attribute it to both natural causes and man-made causes. This kind of understanding of burning fossil fuels, heat trapping blanket, that's not well understood by many. And so the kind of subsequently stopping burning fossil fuels as a path forward isn't clear as it could be or should be at this point in time. And so maybe the other thing, if you'll let me, the other thing I would say is that Canadians consistently report, when you ask them, very high levels of concern about climate change. Right, most people can see forest fires, can see, that's how we are making sense of what climate change is. It is through these kinds of experiences, either directly or our experiences of seeing, extreme weather and natural disasters. So people are expressing very high levels of concern. But if you ask unprompted, what are the issues that you're most concerned about? It often will, addressing climate change is mentioned much, much farther down on the list, right? So affordability and access to healthcare, cost of living, housing. There are many other issues that people are faced with and dealing with in their day-to-day lives.
Okay, we see the term movable middle mentioned in reports and on the ReClimate site. What is the movable middle and why is it so important?
Great question. And I feel compelled to say that I think the term movable middle is used differently by different people. I think in the context of, the work that we do, it kind of comes out of, some of the themes that I was talking about in the last question or last answer. It's this idea that, people are kind of undecided, or they're conflicted about an issue. So they could move either one way or the other, but they're not at the moment oppositional, right? So if you think about, a broader population, there is a segment, of Canadians whose identities are really built around the idea that they don't believe in climate change. They're not going to support, climate action and whatnot. There's also on the other side, a whole group of Canadians whose identity are built around, I'm a climate activist and I'm a climate advocate and, and I'm an environmentalist. And so they're on the other side. But most of us just we live in the middle. Some are more well-informed than others, but for the most part, people are concerned, right? In the middle, they have, when they ask, yes, we want the government to act. We are highly supportive of it. But when it comes down to it, it's this tension around the fact that because they may not be well informed, they're not thinking about this, they have many competing priorities, they're kind of undecided, or sometimes they're just conflicted about an issue, right? Because on the one hand, as an example, yeah, I think we absolutely need renewable energy. We need lots of, solar panels. I just don't want them on my house. Or we need lots of, solar, renewable solar farms. I just don't want them all over the landscape that I cherish from my childhood. So there are many things that, are underneath that are operating underneath for people that kind of create some conflict for them. So when we talk about the movable middle, really, I think what's important is to acknowledge that most people are concerned, they want and they support action, but they're undecided potentially about one particular aspect or issue of it. Or there's some other kind of thing that's happening for them that's creating a conflict, or they're kind of uninformed. So, I think that, one example, or rather, I'll back up, that uninformed piece is particularly important right now as we see more and more kind of organized misinformation and disinformation, right? So, as an example, when I'm in focus groups, I can predict with a lot of certainty, what are some of the kind of key narratives that are going to surface where people are kind of undecided. One of them might be, well, EV batteries are actually worse, for the environment than driving a car. Or there's no way that we're going to be able to electrify everything. The grids can't support it. Or it may be solar panels actually create more emissions when you produce them than they save in their lifetime. So these kind of like very dominant or kind of reoccurring pieces of information. And when people who are not thinking about this a lot or deeply, as much as maybe you or I, or people who are listening to this, so when people encounter this kind of information or confusion about what are the actual solutions, they really don't know what to think, right? So like a third of us sit within that category, right? Of I actually don't know how to make sense of the information that I'm hearing, right? And I don't trust so much of it because I know that I know about misinformation. I know that I shouldn't be trusting everything that I hear, et cetera. So that's kind of the deal with the movable middle, right? So they believe climate change is real. They're not climate deniers. They just may be conflicted or undecided or just not, as informed because they're not thinking about it on a daily basis.
Now, Amber, why is it important for the average communicator, like those in the energy sector, for example, to better understand the strategy behind climate change communications?
Yeah. I think because climate change is a super wicked problem and is really complicated, and maybe me rambling on for the past 20 minutes might give folks a sense of the things that we are trying to think about and grapple with all at the same time. And so I would say that in other cases, although arguably I would argue that information probably doesn't work in on any issue. But what we do know is just giving people information. They're not, people can't reason their way into kind of behavior change. So, we live within systems. We live within communities where, we're surrounded by friends and family. We see ourselves as kind of certain types of people. There are all of these kind of social needs and emotional needs that humans bring to the table that climate change communications, and I would argue probably any good communications, needs to attend to. So this sense of belonging, right? So I belong to a community. Other people like me think and act this way, or I expect other people like me to think and act this way. Being able to understand even what the problem is, to kind of create shared understanding so that people who are making decisions aren't making decisions that don't consider you, that kind of shared understanding piece. People need a sense of efficacy, control in their lives. They need some agency. They just don't need someone making all these decisions on their behalf without any involvement. People want to be seen to be good people and to be able to ask questions and to challenge things that are going to impact their lives without being dismissed as a climate denier or shamed or whatnot. And people trust others for different reasons, right? So scientists are highly trusted, politicians aren't, big corporations aren't, right? But the ones who are often leading this conversation in the public are big corporations and politicians. So all of those are the things that we think about and need to attend to when we think about, climate communications. And because it's such a complicated problem and extends to so many aspects of our life, and to be fair, there's a lot of organized opposition and strategies to create polarization, to create misinformation. There's a lot happening all at the same time.
Okay, let me ask you this. What effect does it have to all be on the same page?
I often give the analogy of an orchestra, right? Where we all have the same song sheet, but we're all playing different instruments. And a part of that is, there is a role for government in setting regulation, and there's a role for activists and advocates to be, opening up, new possibilities, holding governments and corporations to account. But actually, we also need businesses to be building out the products and the services and the things that we'll be using in our lives. And you need all of these different actors operating all at the same time, and to live, I guess, within an ecosystem. So I'm very skeptical of how one message is the efficacy of one message. I think that really what is helpful is if people are exposed to and have the ability to make meaning out of climate change and out of energy transition through many different parts of their lives. And they actually have many different avenues to talk about it and to create, a shared understanding of what they want for their future, or where we're going.
Let's move to electrification and renewable energy. Cool? These are important pieces of the world's response to climate change. For those in the energy sector who have a direct relationship with electricity consumers, is there a certain messaging that we should be sharing with our audiences?
Such a great question. I might have a different thought while I'm making a cup of tea, in a couple of hours from now. But I think that there's goes back to the question that we talked about with literacy. And it also goes back to some of the things I mentioned around people needing to have a sense of control in their lives, right? So what we know from the research is that people's motivation to do something has a whole lot less to do with their perception of risk than it does their perception of their ability to act, and that action will make a difference. What people really, I would say, based on all the things that I look at and read and whatnot, want is a place to act that makes sense and that is relevant to their lives. So I think for folks who work in electrification, work in renewable energy, a part of what we need right now is both to fill in all of the pixels around, like, where are we going? What is this going to look like in my daily life? What are the things that make sense for me to do right now? And how is it the things that I'm doing making a difference within, the broader community that I know and love and want to make sure it's safe and prosperous and all of those things. So I think what we need in part are those people who are responsible for infrastructure, for services, for that kind of daily life to start filling in the pixels of what is this going to mean? Because people get a little stuck of like blind faith. We're just going to hand it over and other people make decisions. people want to have a conversation. They want to have spaces where they can kind of create a shared understanding, right? Like a public imagination of like, where are we going and what's it going to be like when we get there? And what is it going to mean to my daily life? And so I think that there's that part, like, what is this going to look like? And then I think the other part is, what are you asking me to do? And how is it going to make a difference for me and for my community? And Canadians are very generous, right? They're willing to do stuff, even if it doesn't benefit them. If they really believe that it'll, benefit the kind of broader community or collective good, they'll step up. But I would argue that we haven't done a really good job of giving people tangible, practical, relevant things that do make a difference. Neither have we done a great job of filling out the vision of what this is going to look like, right? It's kind of a little bit like a cliff at the moment, right? We're all going to transition to renewables, and we haven't filled in what is that actually going to look like, right? Am I going to have a gas station at the end of my street? I don't know. What is it going to look like? That's what I would say is storytelling, right? What's the story of what this is, how this is going to happen, and what it will look like when we get there.
Okay, Amber, not sure if you're aware, but HydroAWA has committed to being net zero by 2030. Does this kind of messaging resonate with the general public? Are there best practices in how to communicate this type of message in order to influence and maybe even promote change in our community?
Well, I would say if we kind of go back to, when we think about Canadians, right? So I think that you've got a little section of folks who sit on one end who net zero by 2030. That makes a lot of sense. They understand what net zero is. They understand why you've chosen 2030. They understand what getting to net zero, even means. However, it's likely that a section of those people are kind of skeptical. Why? Because they've been hearing a lot of targets and not a lot of action, for many, many decades. And then, so that's, that one group, right? We start to see kind of dropping, belief that, it's possible or that's going to happen. And then you have that whole other group in the middle that I was talking about, where net zero means absolutely nothing. The language net zero means, I'm being a little bit brutal, but it's true, right? Where net zero doesn't really mean a whole lot. And neither does 2030 or the importance of it. And I think, I was sitting in a board room or a meeting room the other day, and we were talking about targets, and it really struck me when the person on the other side said, we know that this is ambitious and we know that it's impossible, but we have to say it because it's actually what science requires of us. It's not a political target. It's actually a scientific target that we need to reduce emissions by this amount, by this period in time. Even if we'll never get there, that's what science requires of us. So I think all that to say, targets, I think, are very helpful for administrators, for policymakers, for business leaders, et cetera, to help, turn the ship and to help start getting the kind of resourcing and planning and whatnot in place. But for the general public, what they actually want is what we were just talking about. Tell me where we're going and tell me what I have to do and tell me why it makes a difference.
Cool. Amber, you were a co-author on an incredible, helpful document entitled Climate Messaging That Works, Talking Energy Transition and Climate Change in Canada, which outlines the concept of message triangle. For me, it was a simple takeaway that could be immediately implemented into any communications surrounding climate change. Could you share the Coles note of the message triangle with our listeners?
I can, and I would love to. And I suspect that, there'll be parts of what I'm about to say that begin to resonate with some of the past things that I've said or are connected to. So, really, in a triangle, the underlying principle is that we're trying to create a whole story or a whole narrative for people. And that has a lot to do with how human beings and how we have evolved and how we make sense of the world. We make sense of the world through narrative and through stories. And so when we just give people one piece of something, it doesn't satisfy the way that we have been trained since since the beginning to kind of make sense of the world. So what we want to do is we want to give people a challenge that has to either be overcome or that we're at risk of losing something. So there's a challenge, there's a choice that we have right now that we need to make, and then there's an opportunity. And if we can hit each piece of that triangle, what we're doing is we're creating a whole story for people, which allows them to make sense of, why are you taking up my time? And why should I listen to you? So, as an example, when we talk about the challenge, part of this is really, I think, being more clear about the cause of climate change, but also what are some of the challenges that we're seeing that are related to climate change within our communities. I was listening to a CBC program the other day, and there's an entire community in Newfoundland that's actually moving back from the water. And this is, after the aftermath of Hurricane Fiona and whatnot. So, some of the challenges that we're seeing, what's the challenge that we're trying to overcome? And ideally, I would right size that at a community scale, right? So people feel overwhelmed when it's my personal individual problem. But if we can begin to talk about this as a community challenge, then people are much more likely to engage because they don't feel like they're in it all on their own. Similarly, a choice, right? As communicators, if we're talking specifically to communicators, we often leave out the choice at the moment. What is the call to action? What are you actually trying? What are you asking someone to do? Is it vote a certain way? Is it have a conversation? Is it take a particular action? We need something. There's some sort of choice and there's some sort of action that has to create tension within this story, right? All the good stories have a choice that has to be made by the main, character. And then the opportunity. And I think, part of what I've been talking about around where are we going, what's it going to look like when we get there, is that opportunity. So if we're talking about the challenge is, we're seeing increasing extreme weather. That's because of burning fossil fuels and pollution, heat trapping blanket. Our choice right now is we need to electrify, and that means building infrastructure. The opportunity that we have is at a community scale, both for ourselves and for others. This kind of whatever it might be the relevance of it, right? We'll have more dependable electricity supply. If we're all in EVs and we have backup, batteries in our cars, when the power goes out, you've got a little mini generator that you can draw on that gives you electricity, through the storm or something, whatever it might look like. But that's the point is that we're trying to create a full picture for people. We want to talk about what's the challenge, what's the choice, and what's the opportunity on the other side.
Now, climate change has been a hot topic for, at least 20 years now. Are there any challenges with keeping an audience engaged and interested for so long?
Yeah, there's actually a woman out of the States who wrote an article. Her name is Suzanne Mosier, and it's something, I'm going to botch the title, but it's something like, climate communications 20 years later, what have we really learned? And I think that, in fairness, I think we've learned a lot, right? I think most people understand that it's more complicated than just giving people a brochure at this point. And I think that in 20 years, we've done a much better job of kind of crystallizing what is it that we need to do. However, there's also been 20 years of misinformation, 20 years of broken plans and not, unachieved targets and et cetera. And I was chatting with a woman the other day, and she goes, I kind of feel like forest fires and floods and hurricanes are doing the job that we used to do, which is creating alarm and concern and demonstrating like this is real and it's a big problem. So I think in 20 years, we've had 20 years more of all of that, but we haven't, but rather I would say the job now in this moment is the pathway, right? And giving people that kind of those choices, that control, that sense of agency that they can do something about it. And we need to get on with the action part, right? So we can't leave people in just concern because our minds can only hold so much anxiety and concern at one time, amongst all of the other things that we're concerned and anxious about. Climate change is just, even more dread, particularly, I think, for younger people. So we can't, people can only stay there for so long before they start to kind of check out, because as I go back to, I kind of mentioned it in the beginning, it's like our sense of whether or not our sense of motivation, or our motivation to act, has a lot more to do with our sense of being able to do something about it rather than the risk that it proposes or that it is. So, so I would say the challenges of keeping people interested are, if you can't give them something to do, then, at a certain point, you kind of have to just check out of the conversation until, you get clear about what are you asking me. And I think that this kind of anxiety is a real problem. And so the road for this moment really requires us to get much more clear about where we're going in the pathway forward.
Okay, Amber, we always end our interviews with some rapid fire questions, and we've got a few for you. Are you ready?
Ready to go.
Okay, what are you reading right now?
Wine Witch on Fire by Natalie McLean, I think.
Okay. Now, what would you name your boat if you had one? Maybe you do, maybe you don't.
I don't have one, and it would be a miracle if I ever have one. So I'm going to name it Miracle.
Who is someone that you truly admire?
This is like kind of really out of left field, but I'm going to go with it. So during COVID, there was a woman named Trinny Woodall who used to do What Not to Wear out of the BBC. It was like one of the original kind of programs, like one of those. And, I'd love to be more philosophical than this, but I admire her because her whole, she works so hard, but also she just wants to make women of a certain age, or any woman, just feel good. And I really just admire someone whose life and business and purpose is really just trying to make other people see the goodness in themselves or to feel better about themselves. So she's also, for anyone who's interested, I mean, a social media like magician. Like she's magic in terms of what she did. She started during COVID and kind of as a comms person, amazing, kind of how she has set herself up as an influencer.
Okay. Amber, what is the closest thing to real magic that you've witnessed?
Oh, magic. Yeah, this is hard. Okay, so just bear with me. Grain of salt. This is not as rapid as you probably want. I'm moving houses. I bought a house, and there were two moments like one was, do I put an offer in, or do we put an offer in? And then there was another moment, kind of later on. And in both cases, I was about to say, I was going to pull back and say, no, I'm not going to go forward with it. And I kid you not, in that moment, the wind picked up. So in one case, I was outside, the wind picked up and got very, very strong where I was standing. So the first time, you can kind of blow it off. And it's like, oh yeah, okay, whatever. That was weird. But it happened twice. It happened a second time. And in the second time where I was, kind of stuck and wanting to retreat and got a little, scared about, kind of taking the leap. And in that second time, same thing happened where the winds picked up and they got a little bit stronger around me, and then they calmed down afterwards. And not in a like, oh, I kind of feel like, it's got a little, it was very dramatic. And so anyways, I move houses tomorrow. So I'm going to just put that out to magic. Not quite sure. It doesn't make a lot of logical sense why we did it, but we're there now.
Now, what has been the biggest challenge to you personally since the pandemic began?
Yeah. Like so many parents, and I would argue women in particular, is the double bind of having to take care of kids as though I don't work, and work as though I don't have kids. And I think a lot of parents, that was the impossible situation, and I don't feel that that's really gone away.
This next one I always enjoy. What have you been watching a lot more of on Netflix or TV lately? What's your favorite, in other words, what's your favorite movie or TV show?
I love the Peaky Blinders. And I've gone back and I've watched certain episodes again, just because they're so delicious with the costumes and the characters and the whole thing. I'm totally enthralled. Yeah, love it.
Okay. Now, lastly, what is exciting you about your industry right now?
I think if anyone were to see my email inbox, they'd be very surprised. I think policy was the king for so long. And I think finally we're at the point where we're beginning to understand that the public has to be on board. The public actually needs to have informed consent about so many of these choices. And we need a social mandate to ensure that climate action is the third rail, right? If you're going to be a leader in this country or a business operating in this country, then you need to be a climate leader and you need to be a climate business. It has to be fundamental to all of the decisions that you make and how you operate, because the science doesn't give us any other choice at this moment. So I think that the kind of realization that we can have all the technology and all the policy that we want, but if people aren't on board, then it's never going to happen. And so I get to work with very interesting people, unexpected, from all walks of life and, different sectors, who are beginning to understand that really this is something we're going to work on until all of us and those beyond for many generations. Yeah.
Now, if our listeners want to learn more about you, Amber, or your organization, how can they connect?
Yeah. Well, easiest is to go to our website. So ReClimate. So that's reclimate.ca. And folks can sign up there if they want to, make sure that they get more information on events. And we do lots of webinars and talks, and we release reports and whatnot. So that's a great thing to do. And I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm always happy to connect with people on LinkedIn. So Amber Bennett. And I also share lots of things there that I find interesting.
Well, Amber, this is it. We've reached the end of another episode of the Think Energy podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you had a lot of fun.
Yeah, great questions, great chat. And thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks for tuning in for another episode of the Think Energy podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review wherever you're listening. And to find out more about today's guest or previous episodes, visit thinkenergypodcast.com. I hope you'll join us again next time as we spark even more conversations about the energy of tomorrow.